Let me tell you folks, it is no exaggeration when I say that Six Flags has committed plenty of plain out atrocities over the years. However, perhaps their greatest crime against humanity was locking up the theme park rights for the Looney Tunes and the DC Comics characters. They took Superman, Batman, and Bugs Bunny and threw them behind the bars of mediocre and subpar attractions while throwing away the key. These have been some of the most iconic and beloved characters in American pop culture for nearly a century at this point, and Six Flags has done nothing with these properties of any sort of notability whatsoever. In fact, they have done a great disservice to these American classics. And it's not like these are properties that have no theme park potential whatsoever. I mean, there's so much you could do from a theming and storytelling perspective with both the Looney Tunes and DC Comics that Six Flags' usage of these characters becomes more and more baffling as time goes on, as 90% of the time, their usage simply amounts to slapping the name of a character onto a ride and then using its color scheme for the ride track. And that's about it. You get no theming, you get no storytelling, you get no actual usage of the character other than maybe a cardboard cutout, and that's about it. There's nothing else of note here whatsoever. It is a complete waste of what these characters can bring to the table. Now, in all fairness to Six Flags, there actually are a few cases of them actually giving a damn and actually attempting to make something actually well-themed when it comes to using these properties. Take, for instance, the very first DC ride they built, that being Batman the Ride. From the recreation of the Batcave to Gotham's underbelly to the Batmobile being out in front of many of the versions of these attractions. Simply put, it goes to show that even just a little bit of theming can go a long way with these attractions. Which, if we're talking about that, look no further than the Dark Knight coaster, which, listen, is a bad ride. Straight up bad. Bad ride. But if it wasn't for the amount of theming and storytelling going on here, it would be an actually downright horrible ride. The story essentially goes that well, you're kind of following the same sort of storyline as The Dark Knight, but you're hopping onto the inner city rail line, and while you're going to make your normal everyday commute, the Joker hijacks it, with the idea being that the track will be demolished while you're riding it. Sorry, couldn't help myself. But both of those Batman attractions absolutely pale in comparison to what Six Flags pulled off with Justice League Battle for Metropolis. This was Six Flags' big attempt to actually make a successfully themed attraction based on the DC Comics characters. And listen, the show building is nice, the facade looks great, and the animatronics are an awesome touch. And I have to say, I have great admiration for Six Flags actually putting in some effort here. However, this also might be one of the worst rides I've ever ridden, okay? It's a shooting ride, but you have to shoot on a screen, and those screens are poorly projected. It's hard to even see what's going on. The animations don't even look all that good, and it's impossible to know if you're scoring points, how to score points. It's just an absolute nightmare of an attraction because you have no idea what's going on. It's a complete mess. And yeah, it sucks. So even when Six Flags really does try to make something great with these properties, they fall flat on their face time and time again. And think about it this way, folks. Look over at Universal Studios. What are they doing over there? At Toon Lagoon, you have some of the most irrelevant cartoon characters of all time, characters that haven't had any new media produced in over 3 decades, headlining some of the greatest water rides ever made. And if you go down the street, well, hey, there's an entire land themed to Marvel with one of the greatest dark rides / simulators ever created in the amazing adventures of Spider-Man. Not to mention that Marvel's not just featured at Universal, it's also featured at Disney, both in Orlando and on the West Coast. And what's DC's representation in the theme park world? This. I mean, it's actually night and day, the treatment that these properties get versus, well, straight up their competitors. And obviously fans of these properties are somewhat sick to their stomach, but you know who is perhaps the most disgusted with this, who perhaps has had a cold, a sickness, a disease that will not quit ever since this deal went through, is Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers owns both the Looney Tunes and DC Comics. They gave the rights to Six Flags in the first place, and now they have made their bed and they've had no choice but to lay in it as they watch their properties be treated as lesser than the properties over at Universal and Disney. And folks, let me make it clear, it's 100% Warner Brothers' fault. They made this situation for themselves. Not that they got suckered into it. It's not like they thought that Six Flags is going to treat the properties better. No, they did it to themselves. You see, in 1993, Warner Brothers went ahead and acquired Six Flags. At the time, of course, their parent company was Time Warner. Time Warner went ahead, bought the entirety of Six Flags, and brought it into the fold. In doing so, many of these Looney Tunes and DC Comics attractions were built. That was when those properties got injected into the Six Flags parks. It seemed at first that Warner Brothers wanted to make Six Flags their foray into the American amusement park industry. But that idea, that dream, quickly became sour and quickly turned into a nightmare for Time Warner, as Time Warner was facing a ton of debt issues at the time. And instead of, continuing to support Six Flags and support that new business venture, they basically said, okay, we're just going to throw it to the wolves. And only 2 years after they acquired Six Flags, they sold 49% of the company to an investment firm and then offloaded $800 million in debt to the Six Flags company, which is crazy because at the time, Six Flags was only valued at maybe $400-500 million, meaning that they had offloaded enough debt to the point where it was almost double the actual value of the entire company. Shortly thereafter, of course, only a few years later in 1998, 5 years after Warner Brothers had bought Six Flags, they went ahead and sold it to Premier Parks. And on the surface, it was kind of no harm, no foul. They didn't necessarily lose a ton of money overall in the deal, and they were able to offload a ton of debt to Six Flags that ultimately stayed with Six Flags when they were sold off. Which, mind you, that debt definitely was a leading contributing factor to the company going bankrupt 10 years later. So kind of funny how Time Warner bought Six Flags, did nothing with them, unloaded a whole bunch of debt onto them, and basically killed the company in about a 15-year time span. Pretty impressive stuff there, but Time Warner still really ended up losing at the end of the day here, because in selling off Six Flags and injecting the DC and Looney Tunes characters into those parks, they gave them the theme park rights for pennies on the dollar. Essentially, Six Flags didn't even have to pay for the theme park rights. They didn't have to pay to acquire them because Time Warner put them in the parks themselves. And instead, they just signed an agreement to be like, okay, we understand we're selling you off, but we're not going to make you re-theme everything. So we're going to give you a very long and lucrative licensing agreement that allows you to hold onto the property. Yes, you're going to have to pay us an annual due per park that you use these characters in. However, it's going to be very reasonable, and you're going to be able to hold on these properties for a very, very long time. And certainly at the time, Warner Brothers didn't think much of it, but now that they're making millions of dollars by just licensing the Harry Potter franchise to Universal, and they're raking in millions of dollars in royalties every year through that deal from them basically kicking their feet up on the desk and doing nothing, they gotta be absolutely just kicking themselves. They gave away these rights for pennies on the dollar. And here's the thing, it's not even like Warner Brothers only gave the rights up for North America. No, Six Flags has the rights in North America, South America, and Europe, excluding Las Vegas. Why? Well, folks, I would tell you, but you know what they say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Yeah. No, actually, I have no idea why it's excluding Vegas, but yeah, for some reason they also don't have the rights in Vegas, but they have the rights pretty much everywhere else in the on the Western Hemisphere. However, there is one notable place that they do not have the rights to these characters, and that is in the Middle East, which has allowed Warner Brothers to not have to keep dreaming about the day that these properties get their time in the sun and get their opportunity to shine. Instead, Warner Brothers has been able to go ahead in creating a theme park there, actually being able to execute on bringing these properties up to snuff and meeting their potential. More specifically, at Warner Brothers World Abu Dhabi, which not only cost a pretty penny to build, but is also the world's largest indoor theme park. And not only does it feature DC and Looney Tunes characters, it is quite literally built on the back of them. That is how important and how lucrative these properties can be in the theme park world. Half of the attractions, actually, let's be honest, majority of the attractions in this park are themed to those characters. And I'm not going to kid you folks, this is not necessarily on the same level as a Universal or a Disney, but it's not that far off. And the quality of these attractions is impressive. The level of theming is impressive. The amount of storytelling is impressive here, and it really does go to show just how much potential these properties have for theme park attractions here in the United States and North America as a whole. The premier attraction here is a Justice League attraction, which is essentially their take on Spider-Man over at Universal, which, I mean, you can't go wrong with knocking off one of the greatest simulators of all time. So, hey, go ahead and do it. And I mean, hey, it works, honestly. Like, the Justice League characters, of course, lend themselves really well to this sort of type of ride and technology, and it's definitely way better than the Justice League ride over at Six Flags. I mean, heck, even the Hall of Justice built for this attraction in the queue blows the one at Six Flags out of the water. It's night and day, the difference. It's ridiculous. Then you have a Batman ride that's essentially like Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey, which, okay, again, I mean, you're copying Universal, but honestly, that's a park that's halfway across the globe. So go ahead, knock yourselves out is what I say. Honestly, it's pretty cool. They do have some actual physical sets here. It's a cool storyline with Batman fighting several of his different villains. Maybe the screens could be blended in a little bit more, but honestly, it's a really cool use of Batman and a way to get all of his villains into a storyline. Again, shows what's possible with these characters. And there are also certainly a number of other notable attractions here. There's a Green Lantern flying theater attraction similar to, say, a Soarin', but with a bit of more of an intense sort of feeling to it with a more action-packed storyline. That's arguably one of their better rides from what I'm hearing. They also have a Looney Tunes themed shooting ride, which seems like a no-brainer to do with Looney Tunes, of course, make a shooting attraction. And there are some physical parts of this attraction that actually have things that move when you hit the target, which is also very fun. However, about half of it is screen-based, which is... Sorry, folks. That's just disgusting. I can't... no. Let's stop with the screen-based shooting rides, okay? They suck, unless you're Toy Story Mania. And then to send us on home, we have a Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner-themed roller coaster, which, as you might be able to tell, is essentially Big Thunder Mountain, but inverted. Which, I mean, sure, why not? It makes sense, it works, it looks like a cool and fun ride, and the great thing about this is, I mean, this is something that Six Flags themselves could pull off. The theming here is nothing crazy on this attraction. It's a roller coaster. That's Six Flags bread and butter. But they've never even been willing to go this level or this far into actually being able to theme an attraction to these characters in a meaningful and substantial way. They literally do not care so much to the point where they're not even willing to go this far. And here's the thing, is that if you were impressed by what you saw out of Warner Brothers World, then that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's not even beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible with these properties. Yeah, it blows Six Flags out of the water, and it really makes what they're doing even more sort of sad and disgusting that that's the best they can come up with. But what we do know is that if for whatever reason, if there was ever a possibility of these properties being put in the hands of a Universal or Disney, we know that the sky is the limit. We know that they could do a whole lot better than what Warner Brothers World was able to put to the table, right? And history has proven as much. Just look at some of the original concepts for Islands of Adventure. Before there was a Marvel Superhero Island and before there was a Toon Lagoon, there was a DC Comics land and a Looney Tunes land that were originally supposed to be a part of this park. Looney Tunes and DC, after years of cruel and unusual punishment in the theme park world, would have finally been given their time to shine. But Warner Brothers said no. And listen what they said no to, folks. In the Looney Tunes land, perhaps the biggest attraction would have been a Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner themed roller coaster. Hey, Warner Brothers World, where'd you get that idea from? That's interesting. Of course, this would have also been somewhat similar to Big Thunder Mountain, but it wouldn't have been inverted. It would have essentially, though, been Universal's take on Big Thunder Mountain, essentially. But still, would have had plenty of Acme-related gags, plenty of Looney Tunes gags that are typical to the series thrown in there as well. The other major ride would have also been, oddly enough, another roller coaster, but this one an indoor roller coaster themed to Duck Dodgers and Marvin the Martian. Once again, Universal's version of Space Mountain. Okay. Universal, maybe not the most creative ideas here for Looney Tunes. And if you thought that that was the only idea they were ripping off from Disney, they were apparently also thinking about doing a flying carpet ride using the same ride technology as E.T. based on the Looney Tunes short Alibaba Bunny, which is very much so based on the story of Aladdin. So, I mean, they were just going crazy with, I guess, just trying to go like the Shrek route where you're just knocking off and making fun of Disney the entire way. I guess that works for Looney Tunes, sure. I mean, there were other ride concepts that were thought of for this land, but those were sort of the big three. Those are the big three kahunas. And I mean, there's no doubt looking at the concept art, this land would have been really fun, would have been really cool, would have had a bunch of fun Easter eggs and hidden details and jokes and gags throughout the entire land. There's no doubt about it. And I'm sure that even if Universal was doing nothing but ripping off Disney, that they would have turned into their own, similar to Dudley Do-Right's Rips Off Falls, which, let's be honest, folks, for as great of an attraction that is, it is 100% a knockoff and a ripoff of Splash Mountain. It is effectively Universal's version of that attraction, but it's still wholly unique at the end of the day. So I have no doubt about it that Universal would have executed on the same level for this Looney Tunes world. But when it comes to the DC Comics land, which would have been a mashup of Gotham and Metropolis, let me tell you, there was absolutely no ripping off or copying or cheating from someone else's homework here. No, this was a wholly unique set of ideas that they had for this land. One of those being a 3D Superman ride where he would be battling Lex Luthor, and of course you'd be along for the ride. It would actually be somewhat like Spider-Man, as after all, Spider-Man did replace this ride when it was ultimately scrapped. So don't get me wrong, I do think we're better off for it. However, there's no doubt about it that if this attraction were to be built and was still standing today, it would have been the definitive Superman theme park attraction without a question. And we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation saying, man, Superman is really being done a disservice over at Six Flags, just having a flying roller coaster with no theming on it whatsoever. The case would not only be closed, but it never would have even opened in the first place. But let me tell you folks, this is absolutely nothing. This is peanuts in comparison to what they were planning to do with Batman, because his attraction was really going to blow everything else we talked about here today out of the water. This was going to be a dueling roller coaster with the Batman versing the Penguin, and you got to choose which side you want to ride on. Essentially, it was dueling dragons, but themed to Batman. And of course, as we know, dueling dragons, despite being a primarily original concept and not really based on much of any prior material whatsoever, actually had a ton of theming and storytelling in that attraction. So just imagine if they went ahead and they took that level of theming and storytelling over to a Batman attraction. Oh my god, it maybe would stand to be one of the greatest attractions to ever grace the planet Earth. Like Dueling Dragons, this attraction would have featured several near-miss elements between the two ride vehicles, but unlike Dueling Dragons, would actually fly over the land itself, making it largely unlike any of the other concepts we discussed here today that were either influenced by Disney or ended up being adapted into an attraction that we ultimately end up getting. This attraction was wholly unique and not something that we ever really ended up seeing being executed on at the same level as what was originally thought up for Batman. And like the Looney Tunes land, this is just scratching the surface. Of course, there were other ideas like a Batman stunt show in the lagoon, which is interesting because they haven't done any stunt show or show of that size or magnitude or at all inside the lagoon in Islands of Adventure whatsoever. So that's kind of interesting that the idea sort of came and went. And there was also an idea for a Joker-themed Madhouse Funhouse style Wild Mouse coaster. Joker-themed Wild Mouse coaster. Wonder whatever happened to that idea. But anyways, folks, you may be wondering, why didn't Warner Brothers take Universal up on this deal? We mentioned how they're absolutely disgusted by how their properties are being used at Six Flags. Why would they not take Universal up on this offer to be featured in their brand new park at Universal Orlando? And make no mistake about it, folks, this was when Warner Brothers still owned Six Flags. So it's not like they didn't have the theme park rights to give away. They did. There was no deal locked in with Six Flags giving them the exclusive rights. They could absolutely sign this deal with Universal, but actually the reason why it didn't happen was because of a fight over royalty fees. Warner Brothers wanted 10% royalties and Universal was only willing to offer 5%. Now Warner Brothers came back and said, okay, we'll give you a deal. Let's compromise. Let's do 8%. But Universal was stingy. They said no shot. We're sticking to 5%, and they turned around and went to their competitors because Marvel literally signed away their soul to Universal. I mean, that deal is so in favor of Universal, it's ridiculous. The deal is literally in perpetuity, meaning that so long as Universal wants to hold on to the rights for Marvel, they can. No, Disney or Marvel themselves can't do anything about it. They will literally own the rights forever so long as they keep that land standing. So I completely understand why Universal did not compromise, because they had such a good deal sort of sitting on their doorstep from the competitor. But if you're Warner Brothers, man, you really gotta be saying, man, we really said no to that over 3% royalties, and now we have these properties in Six Flags basically collecting dust. What a shame. So yeah, it's a shame what happened in the past in regards to these properties, but maybe there's a chance to rectify it in the future. After all, we know there is a deadline, there's an end date on this deal with Six Flags. We did establish that it was a very long time, right? We discussed it earlier, but how long could it really be? After all, that deal went through in 98, so it's got to be sort of coming up on the end, right? Well, let's take a look. The year that the license agreement between Six Flags and Warner Brothers comes to an end is 2053. So you thought this deal was already a blunder by Warner Brothers? When you consider the fact that this deal is almost 60 years in length, that really puts into perspective just how bad of a deal Warner Brothers signed with Six Flags. Like, holy cow, how stupid are you to not see the potential in these properties and to give them away to Six Flags for next to nothing just so you could dump the property after 5 years? Like, bro, what a stupid mistake. So now not only is it a case of making your bed and laying in it, no, this is a case of making your bed and quite literally going into hibernation because you set the end date so far out. There's nothing Warner Bros. Can do to terminate this contract. They're locked into that until 2053, meaning that there's no chance for Warner Bros. To take those rights back and do with it as they please. They can't give them to Universal to see what they can do with it. They can't build their own theme parks here in North America using those properties for another almost 3 decades from now. Meaning the only way to free the Looney Tunes and DC from their cruel and sad theme park existence would be to basically initiate some sort of 3-way trade. Right, basically have Universal, Warner Brothers, and Six Flags come up with some sort of deal where Universal ends up with the rights, or maybe Warner Brothers ends up with the rights, and then Six Flags gets something in return for that, whether it's monetary or some other theme park rights they can replace them with, or some sort of grace period where maybe, Universal or Warner Brothers gets to use the properties as well as Six Flags. I don't know. It would be a crazy deal. It would be defined as a blockbuster trade. But listen, folks, if Luka Doncic can go ahead and get traded to the Lakers, hey, anything is possible, folks. So don't give up hope. Maybe there is a chance to still free these poor prisoners of war who have been shackled to these horrible, terrible rides for years now and are set to be shackled to them for decades to come. Maybe there's a chance to free them early from their undeserved punishment. And speaking of undeserved punishment, if you want to talk about what the Six Flags Corporation has done to Six Flags Great Adventure and how they've absolutely just bulldozed that thing to dirt with a crazy plan for the future, go ahead and click the video on your screen right now, and I'll see y'all next time. Peace.